This is version 29 of the Brawl Stars competitive tier list, specifically looking at the draft format. This could be the most unique tier list ever made. Rather than asking pros from just 1 or 2 regions, this tier list was created from the feedback of 38 pros from the whole world. So not only is it the largest collaborative effort between a bunch of pros, and in addition to the North American pros, we've also got feedback from pros in Europe, Asia, Latin America, and everywhere else. So this really could be the most accurate global meta tier list ever created. You'll also notice we added the D tier. With 60 brawlers in the game, I felt like it was about necessary, and starting off, the worst of the worst is Edgar. Not much has changed since the last tier list. Edgar was bad competitively before, he's bad now, he hasn't had any changes, his range is really short, lots of brawlers can counter him. Also staying in the F tier is Shelly. She does have decent range that Edgar doesn't, however she deals hardly any damage from that maximum range, and competitively, she's just not a good option. Just like Dynamite is also still not a good option. I know there are Dynamite mains out there that are just like, hate me for saying this, but it's too easy to dodge his shots, and pro players are so good at doing this, so there's just no reason to play him at the competitive meta right now. Now, if the C tier brawlers were just useless or terrible, the D tier brawlers are bad. They're not awful, but they're definitely not competitive. And at the bottom of the D tier is Otis, who is moving down from the B tier. Otis's super is really good at preventing burst damage from an enemy, but it really doesn't do very much else. I think a lot of us underestimated how situational Otis's super actually is, because most of the time you can just fall back and wait until that time is up, and you'll still be alive. Next we have Mr. P, who's moving from the B tier down into the D tier. I know it looks like he's skipping the C tier, but remember that wasn't before. The D tier wasn't here before, so just keep that in mind. Brawlers like Carl, Janet, Amber, even Nita, they've all risen up to the top, which means, and they can all attack through his porters, which means that Mr. P is just not very good. He hasn't received any nerfs or anything like that, but definitely down in the D tier for the current meta. Next we have Jackie, who's moving from the F tier up into the D tier. Even with her recent damage buff, she was barely able to move up at all. Still, she moved up, which is good. She's just another brawler that has really little range and no good abilities to help her get close to enemies, at least competitively. Next is El Primo, who's moving from the C tier down into the D tier. Not much of a move though, because it's a new tier. His biggest issue is his small range as well. However, he's a little bit better than Jackie because he actually has his jump that he can use to get to enemies. Next is Colt from the C tier down to the D tier. Colt can deal a lot of damage with each ammo, but honestly, it's just not enough to consistently kill brawlers because he usually doesn't hit brawlers with all of his bullets. This makes him like pretty okay in heist, but that's about it, and even then, there are better options at the moment. Bull is moving from the B tier down to the D tier. Once again, short range, really struggles in this meta. His super's a little bit better than some of the others, but he certainly is not competitive. Next is the C tier, and the C tier is for brawlers that aren't competitive, but aren't like terrible. Like you can play them, they're not too bad for quests and the right maps and modes, but you probably should never draft them. And at the bottom of the C tier is Jessie. Jessie's main attack is pretty strong, especially if she can hit more than one target. However, her turret's really easy to avoid, and it's also really easy to destroy, even though she might have just like a tiny little bit of viability in heist, not competitively. She isn't competitive, which is why she's in the C tier. Next in the C tier, we have Gus starting out here for the first time. Now, it is the beginning of the new season. Gus isn't even out yet, so this is very much like we're gonna place him here based off of my very limited experience playing him in the developer build against bots, which are not the same as real people. But from what I've played and what some of the very few pros have played, it sounds like he'll be a little bit below average, and who knows, maybe he'll get buff before he actually gets released, and in which case he could be anywhere. Staying in the C tier is 8-Bit. 8-Bit's slow movement speed is really hurting him a lot in this meta. There are fast brawlers that he struggles against. He has enough range to keep himself out of the bottom 2 tiers, but a lot of the top brawlers have abilities to make it really easy to get to him. Brock is moving from the B tier down to the C tier. Brock does have good range, but he's very fragile. And even worse than his low health and his slow projectile speed is that he's almost incapable of using auto aim. It's really hard to hit your attacks. It's easy to avoid. One way or another, with the addition of the D tier, he's moving down a bit. Just like Tara is moving from the B tier to the C tier as well. She obviously has a very powerful super, but it takes so long to charge it. She usually only gets maybe 1 or 2 supers in a competitive match, and if she misses one of them, the whole match is pretty much ruined for her. Next is Byron, who's moving from the A tier down into the C tier. He's gotten quite a few nerfs now that he just can't put out the damage like he used to. His reload speed, it's really slow, and that hurts both of his damage and his healing, and his supercharge rate is slow, which means that him being as fragile as he always has been isn't quite worth putting up with anymore. Barley's moving from the B tier down into the C tier. Barley can deal a good amount of damage in large areas, but he still gets outranged by most other throwers, and he just relies a little bit too heavily on walls, which are really easy to break in competitive matches. Next is Mortis, moving from the B tier down into the C tier. Don't hate the messenger. This is just a friendly reminder that I didn't make this tier list. The pros really impacted this a lot, okay? Now, Mortis does counter a decent number of brawlers, but if there's even one brawler on the enemy team that counters Mortis, usually they just focus on Mortis the whole time, and competitively, he's just not a good option at the moment. Next is Nani, staying in the C tier. She was a bit higher in the meta back when squishier brawlers were also in the meta, but nowadays, she just doesn't face brawlers that she can one-shot with her super as much, and then there's the shield gear, which makes the problem even worse for her. Eve is moving from the A tier down to the C tier. This is a situation where I would have loved to have her higher, but the pros have spoken. Eve kind of runs into the same situation that Mr. P does, where there's a lot of brawlers that deal splash damage high up in the meta that you're playing against very frequently, which makes it so that Eve just isn't as good as an option at the moment. Lou is moving from the B tier down to the C tier. He has pretty good stats all around, and his super can be so annoying, but his main attack is only good if all of his projectiles hit, which just doesn't happen competitively very often. He's kind of like a sharpshooter in a way, but that doesn't have the range like a sharpshooter does. Next is Grom, moving from the A tier down to the C tier, near the top. Grom's main attack, very easy to dodge. The pattern is very basic. You know what's happening. If you get good at playing against Grom, it's very hard for Grom to take you out. However, he does do a lot of damage, and his super is also pretty insane as well. The top of the C tier feels about right for him. Rose is moving from the B tier down to the C tier. Her main attack is a short range, but at least she doesn't have to be right next to an enemy to deal a lot of damage. That does make a lot of difference. Plus, she has a few abilities that can really help her move closer to enemies. So top of the C tier seems like, you know, maybe she's on the cusp of you wanting to play her on one map, maybe. Next, we have the B tier with brawlers that are considered to be competitive. However, they're not the best. So you're typically only going to want to play them on certain maps, certain modes to counter certain brawlers, or if you have them as a last pick and they don't have a counter. And starting off the bottom of the B tier is Frank. Frank just has an absurd amount of health, and he has some decent range for how big he is. Even if he can't catch up to enemies, he usually ends up doing enough for his team just by pushing the enemies back with his health alone. And if he doesn't have a counter, he is truly an undead monster. Next is Meg, staying in the B tier. She received a slight buff, so obviously she is slightly better. She still requires the same amount of ammo to charge her super, but even one projectile makes a big difference when it comes to charging her super, and she's in her mecha a lot more often now. And by a lot, I mean not so much that we're bumping her up, but B tier seems good for her. Tick is staying in the B tier. Tick is actually a very solid choice for knockout and sometimes bounty because of how far he can throw his mines and keep enemies from healing. Since he's pretty bad overall in other modes, B tier seems to be about where he belongs. Daryl also belongs in the B tier. He probably would have been higher in the meta if it weren't for the fact that almost every single S tier brawler counters him pretty hard. He can be a solid pick because of how many brawlers have a hard time just stopping him, but he really struggles from two good counters in the meta at the moment. BB is staying in the B tier. Unlike most close range brawlers, BB doesn't really need to hit enemies at point blank to deal her damage, so she can actually hit targets from pretty far away, and then also you have her super, which can reach even further, so even if enemies aren't right next to her, she can help a little bit and push enemies back. Buzz is staying in the B tier. He got a small health buff, and it does seem to be doing a lot for him because of how he plays. Now, even though his range is really short, his super allows him to assassinate those longest range brawlers in the game, which makes him a great counter against certain brawlers, especially if the enemy team hasn't drafted a counter against him. Sandy is staying in the B tier. His range is below average, he can't 3-shot as many brawlers as he used to, and that is a big reason why he was so good in the past. His super can be tough to charge sometimes, but it's still such a good super, and because of his super, it's really hard to put him lower than the B tier. Pam is also staying in the B tier. She offers really good support with her super, but she can't really use it very offensively. I mean, she does have that star power, but it's not that great. At least you want her turret in a good spot for your team, not to deal damage. Her main attack covers a lot of area, but if the enemy can avoid it, there's not really very much else that Pam can do. Sprout is moving from the A tier down to the B tier. Sprout is one of the most map-dependent brawlers in the game. It's so OP on maps with lots of walls, but it doesn't do very well against brawlers that can break those walls or really aggressive brawlers that can kind of get close to Sprout. Nita is moving from the F tier all the way up into the B tier. She received a couple of big buffs, not only to her attack damage, so that she's less dependent on her bear, but also she got a buff to her supercharging rate so she can put her bear more frequently. She's not actually quite as good as I thought she was going to be because of her short range, but she is in the B tier and can be solid. Ash is staying in the B tier. He's a little inconsistent because he's definitely a below average brawler if he doesn't have his rage bar filled, but he quickly becomes one of the best brawlers in the game when it's all the way full. So the reason why he's dropped from near the top of the B tier down to like the middle of it is because his super is kind of useless against some of the most used brawlers right now, kind of like Mr. P or Eve. Next is Rico, who is staying in the B tier. Rico's another brawler that's very dependent on the map, and I mean, on some maps, he's just insane. On others, he's kind of useless. However, brawlers with long range don't really have a problem with him on open maps, which is why he's in the B tier. Piper is moving from the A tier down into the B tier. She's one of the best long-range brawlers in the game because of how much damage she can actually do from far away, but she is helpless once close-range brawlers get close to her, and there are some brawlers in the game at the moment that can close that gap very easily. Leon is moving from the A tier down into the B tier. He has very high burst damage at close range, and he can chip away from enemies from far away. He's kind of fallen from grace over the past couple of updates because his vision gear can be equipped to any brawler, and it counters him pretty hard. So it doesn't matter what the enemy has, as long as they have that vision gear, he's gonna struggle. Ems is moving from the A tier down to the B tier. She's a great counter to close range brawlers due to her high DPS and her super that slows in order to keep them from trying to escape. That makes her a solid option on maps with lots of walls and grass, but without those and without tanks for her to actually counter, she's not good. So B tier seems solid for her. Lola's moving from the bottom of the S tier to almost the top of the B tier. It seems like a big jump because we're skipping the A tier. However, it's a little bit more like a jump and a half. Yes, she can do a lot of great damage. However, there are a lot of strong S tier brawlers right now that can actually counter her because they can attack Lola and her shadow at the same time. However, you can't ignore the fact that she does a lot of damage per second. So in the right situation, she can be played pretty well. Bo is moving from the A tier to the very top of the B tier. The projectile speed of his main attack makes his arrows pretty easy to land, but his mines are also very easy to play around if you know exactly where they placed. Because pro players are typically pretty good at paying attention to that, he's not quite as good. However, just keep in mind that if you're not in the competitive meta, Bo's actually really great. Next, we have the A tier brawlers. These are pretty much good in a lot of different situations, a lot of maps and modes. They're never really a bad choice. However, there are some S tier brawlers that are just another step above. And Belle is staying in the A tier. She has some of the furthest range in the game, and her attack is great at keeping enemies away from each other. She also does well against tanks since her super makes it extremely hard for them to play aggressively, because once they get flagged by that, the damage increase is just insane. Squeak is moving from the S tier to the A tier. Squeak still has one of the best gadgets in the game, and it can be effective in nearly every single game mode. Since his second star power also slows enemies down, Squeak usually slows down quite a few enemies every match, but players are getting a little bit better at playing around Squeak, which is why he's in the A tier. Fang is moving from the B tier up into the A tier. He could be the best close range brawler in the game right now because his main attack actually has more range than a lot of regular brawlers, right? He also has really high DPS up close, and his super can get him wherever he needs to be. Next is Surge, who is staying in the A tier. Surge is a strong counter to tanks because close range brawlers can't really do anything with him without feeding him and allowing him to jump onto them and push them away with his super. And although he struggles against long range brawlers until he charges up his super multiple times, once he is maxed out in the match, it's very hard to kill a Surge, even from a long distance away. Crow's moving from the S tier to the A tier. The nerf to his gadget was the reason why he's actually moving from here, but his gadget is still good enough to keep him in the A tier. It's just that 3 seconds isn't quite as game-breakingly strong as it was at 5 seconds. Gale is staying in the A tier. Just like Surge, Gale is a great option for countering tanks since his whole build seems like it was designed around keeping close range brawlers away from them. On top of that, his star powers makes him really good against all kinds of brawlers, and his stats are above average in comparison to most brawlers. Colette is moving from the B tier up into the A tier. She's actually similar to Gale, except she's even more versatile since her attacks have more range. Her gadget heals her enough to where it's useful even against squishy brawlers, and her super can deal more damage to some tanks than most attacks can in the game. Spike is staying in the A tier. He doesn't have a whole lot of weaknesses. Long range, short range, it doesn't really matter, and his super is able to slow enemies down. It's always a great ability to have for pretty much any type of situation. The one thing you have to keep in mind with him is his slower reload speed, but A tier is a great place for him. Amber is moving from the B tier up into the A tier. Amber has a lot of DPS, but her big struggle is when she gets faced off against assassins. Most of the assassins are kind of struggling in this meta, which means that Amber is actually a solid competitive pick, and she's really easy to play. You just hold that auto aim. Jean is staying in the A tier. I've said this before, but Jean's mechanics are just so good that he'll never be bad unless he had some sort of major reworks. Brawlers like Eve and Mr. P are down in the meta right now, which means that Jean is even more usable now than he was before. Stu is in the A tier with one caveat. At the time that I'm recording this, Stu has a glitch where his gadget will charge his super at any time, and until that is fixed, Stu is absolutely 100% sure in the S tier. He's really good at the moment. I'm almost positive that Supercell's going to fix this soon, and after they do that, he's definitely in A tier, and since I'm so confident that's going to happen, I'm leaving him in the A tier for now, but just keep that in mind. Next we have Colonel Ruffs, who is staying in the A tier. He's just another brawler that just seems like he's never bad because of his super, right? Any brawler with his power up is better than they were before, and that makes him really good, especially when paired with other brawlers that are really good. Next is Penny, who is staying in the A tier. tier. I just want to be very clear that it was a difficult choice to decide if we should put her in A tier or move her up into the S tier. She got a small nerf to her health, but it clearly has not affected her very much. A lot of the pros said that she was S tier, so keep that into consideration. However, I felt a little weird moving her up into the S tier when she did get a nerf. Her gadget counters close range brawlers. Her attack range is good against medium range brawlers. No brawler can outrange her cannon. She's very good, which is why I put her in the very top of the A tier. And that means we're down to the S tier brawlers, the best of the best. These are pretty much competitive almost all the time right now. And these are who you should either ban or build your comps around. B is moving from the B tier up into the bottom of the S tier. She was not any of the pros' top 3 picks, but almost every single one of them said she should be in the S tier right now. She's one of the most solid picks in draft because no brawler really outranges her. She really shuts down tanky brawlers and assassins, and she does fine against every other brawler in between. Does she seem too strong? No, but she's just so solid in every situation that she definitely deserves the S tier. Carl is staying in the S tier. His health got nerfed a decent amount, and honestly, I'm kind of surprised that he's still as good as he is. His main attack is just insanely strong and provides a ton of area control. Then you have his flying hook gadget paired with his super, and he becomes this assassin. He shouldn't be an assassin, but he is. He's really good. Bonnie's also staying in the S tier, and just like Carl, she also received a health nerf, and apparently that was not a problem for her. Her cannon's projectile speed makes her shots really easy to hit, and her super allows her to win pretty much any 1v1. Janet is also staying in the S tier, and she surprised me the most because she received 2 nerfs, and she's still one of the best brawlers in the game. Even though she can't charge her super as often, you really don't need it unless there's an emergency, and even if you don't have it, you can use her gadget to get out of tight spots as well. She's kind of unkillable in a lot of situations. It's really hard to kill a Janet. Then we have Sam, who is starting off in the S tier. Now, I want it to be very clear that a lot of the pros still have not been able to play Sam very much yet. Some of them have, but a lot of them haven't. With that said, from the little we have seen from him, he definitely seems insanely strong. A lot of the pros actually listed him as one of their top 3 brawlers. His abilities are just so good, and they make him usable on almost every map, any mode, even though he's a close range brawler. He is a very high skill cap brawler though, because you want to try and manage his knuckle busters, and when you have them, when you throw them, when you heal, when you use it for a speed boost. There's a lot to manage with him, but as more people figure out how to play him, I think he's only going to rise in the meta. In fact, he could be the best brawler in the game, but I didn't want to put him there because we don't have very much data on him yet. Next, we have Max, who's moving from the A tier into the S tier, one of the top 3 brawlers in the game right now. She hasn't received any buffs or nerfs for quite a while, but I guess the way that the meta has shifted, she has benefited a lot. Her movement speed and her high damage per second almost always makes her she's kind of like this long range assassin, and her ability to increase her teammates' movement speeds has always been extremely useful. I think a reason why we don't see her very much in non-competitive play is because her super does rely on her teammates, but pros are so good at doing that, which is why competitively she is in the top 3. Number 2 in the top 3 is Poco, who is moving from the C tier all the way up to number 2. His attack damage got a huge buff, and it really shows. He instantly went from not being able to 1v1 pretty much anybody to being able to 1v1 pretty much everybody. His mechanics have always just been good, and he's just been a little bit too weak in the past. Now that he isn't, and he can actually deal some damage, he's nearly unstoppable. And another unstoppable brawler is Griff, moving from the B tier to the very top of the tier list. Number 1 is Griff. When I asked the pros their top 3 brawlers, Griff was almost always mentioned within the 3. It's not necessarily because he himself is crazy strong, although he is. It's because of how well he counters a lot of the other best brawlers in the game right now. Plus, you have his second star power, which increases his survivability, healing that 15% every second. It actually turns out is really good right now and can pretty much shape any map to work in his favor. And there you have it, all 60 brawlers ranked from worst to best. Make sure you grab that screenshot, because like I said, this could be the most accurate picture of the entire Brawl Stars meta from across the globe because of the 38 pros who helped put this piece together. Now, as a reminder, not even the pros 100% agree with every brawler placement in every single tier, especially when you take a look at different metas from across the globe. So I want to know which brawlers you think should go up in the tier list and which ones you think should go down. So let me know in the comment section below. Make sure you subscribe for future tier lists, where I will try to do this as frequently as I can, as soon after the balance changes as possible. Subscribe for my other channels, and also here's another Brawl Stars video that I think you would like to watch. For now, this is KairosTime ticking by. We will see you in Brawl Stars.